The morning sun poured through the large glass windows of Halcyon Trust Bank, casting golden streaks on the polished marble floors. It was a brisk autumn day, and the air outside carried a sharp chill that urged customers to step quickly into the warmth of the lobby. Inside, the atmosphere was bustling, tellers clicked away at keyboards. Managers discussed figures in hushed tones, and customers shifted impatiently in line. James Fletcher, an elderly black man with a neatly trimmed white beard, entered the bank with measured steps. His presence was unassuming yet dignified. Dressed in a perfectly pressed navy suit, he carried a leather briefcase that bore the marks of decades of use. Each step he took was accompanied by the soft tap of his cane against the floor. The receptionist, a young man named Ethan Collier, barely glanced up as James approached. Ethan was engrossed in his phone, his thumbs moving rapidly across the screen. Without lifting his head, he muttered, "Yes? How can I help you?" James offered a polite smile, his deep voice steady. "Good morning. I'd like to speak to someone about a problem with my account." Ethan sighed, setting his phone down with visible reluctance. He scanned James quickly, taking in the worn edges of his briefcase and the simplicity of his attire. His expression hardened into a subtle smirk. "Do you have an appointment?" "No. I was hoping someone could assist me without one. It's an urgent matter," James replied, his tone calm. Ethan raised an eyebrow, his voice laced with condescension. "This is a high-priority branch. We typically don't handle walk-ins for issues like that. You might want to try the branch across town." James maintained his composure, though a flicker of disappointment crossed his eyes. "I've been banking here for over 30 years. I've never had trouble resolving an issue in person before." Ethan shrugged, his indifference palpable. "Times change. Let me check if someone's available." As Ethan picked up the phone, another employee, Julia Morris, stepped out from her office. Julia was a mid-level banker known for her sharp suits and even sharper tongue. She noticed James and approached the reception desk, her high heels clicking against the floor. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone brisk. Ethan grinned slightly. "This gentleman says he has an account issue. No appointment." Julia's eyes swept over James, her gaze cold and assessing. "What's the issue, sir?" James adjusted his grip on his cane, his voice steady. "There seems to be an error with my account balance. A significant sum is missing, and I'd like it corrected." Julia frowned, skepticism clouding her features. "Do you even have an account here? What's the name on the account?" "James Fletcher," he replied, handing her his identification. Julia barely glanced at the ID before placing it back on the counter. "Well, Mr. Fletcher, it's unusual for errors like this to happen. Are you sure you checked everything properly? Sometimes people misunderstand their statements." James's patience remained intact. "I assure you, this is not a misunderstanding. I'd appreciate it if you could investigate the matter." Julia hesitated, then motioned to Ethan, "Call security." Ethan's smirk widened as he picked up the phone. On it, James raised an eyebrow but kept his voice calm. "Is there a reason security is being involved?" Julia crossed her arms, her tone growing harsher. "We've had incidents before, people coming in with false claims to try and scam the bank. It's a precaution." James stood still, his grip tightening on his cane. "I have been a customer here longer than either of you have worked. I am not here to waste your time or mine." Before Julia could respond, a burly security guard appeared. His expression was stern as he approached. "What's going on?" Julia gestured to James. "This gentleman is causing a disturbance. He's making baseless claims about his account." The guard turned to James, his voice firm. "Sir, I think it's best if you leave for today. We don't tolerate disruptions here." James looked around the lobby. Other customers had begun to notice the scene, some whispering among themselves while others avoided eye contact. Despite the mounting tension, he refused to raise his voice. "I am not causing a disturbance," he said evenly. "I am asking for the service I've been entitled to as a loyal customer of this bank." The guard's stance didn't waver. "Sir, please leave." James stood in silence for a moment, his gaze shifting between Julia, Ethan, and the guard. The air seemed heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, he gave a slight nod. "Very well," he said quietly, "but I will return, and this matter will be resolved." With that, James turned and walked toward the exit, his cane tapping softly against the floor. The whispers grew louder as the door swung shut behind him, leaving an uneasy stillness in his wake. The brisk autumn air greeted James as he stepped out of Halcyon Trust Bank. But its chill barely registered against the storm brewing inside him. For a man who had built a lifetime of respect and dignity, the blatant dismissal he had just experienced was more than a mere inconvenience. It was a stain on the principles of fairness and decency he held dear. James paused on the sidewalk, his hand gripping the head of his cane as he gazed back at the imposing building. Its tall glass windows gleamed in the sunlight, a fortress of wealth and power that now felt distant and unwelcoming. With a steady breath, James straightened his posture and hailed a taxi. As he settled into the backseat, the driver, a chatty young woman named Carla, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Rough day?" she asked. Sensing his somber mood, James managed a faint smile. "You could say that. Just came from the bank." Carla snorted. "Yeah, they're all the same. Only care about you if you're a millionaire." Her words lingered with James as the cab navigated the busy streets. She wasn't wrong. What he'd faced today wasn't unique to him. It was part of a larger pattern, one he'd seen repeated throughout his life. But what separated James from others was his refusal to accept it quietly. The taxi came to a stop outside a modest brick townhouse. James stepped out, tipping his hat to Carla as she drove off. Inside, the warm scent of coffee greeted him, along with the comforting sound of jazz softly playing from a vintage record player. "James, is that you?" a voice called from the kitchen. And moments later, his wife, Margaret, appeared. She was a petite woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. Her brow furrowed as she took in her husband's expression. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. James set his briefcase on the dining table and sank into a chair. "The bank. They refused to help me. Treated me like I didn't belong there." Margaret sat across from him, her hand covering his. "You've been banking there for years. What could have possibly gone wrong?" James recounted the interaction, his tone calm but his words weighted with frustration. Margaret listened intently, her expression growing more resolute with each detail. "They humiliated you," she said when he finished. "That's unacceptable." James nodded. "I won't let it go. Margaret, this isn't just about me, it's about everyone they dismiss without a second thought. People who don't have the means or the confidence to stand up for themselves." Margaret squeezed his hand. "What are you going to do?" James's gaze grew firm. "I'm filing a formal complaint. And I'm not stopping there. If they think they can treat their customers this way, they're sorely mistaken." The next day, James returned to the bank, not as a dismissed customer but as a man on a mission. This time, he bypassed the reception desk and headed straight to the office of the branch manager. Henry Cooper. Henry was a tall, balding man in his 50s, with an air of authority that commanded respect. When James entered his office unannounced, Henry looked up from his desk. Startled, "Mr. Fletcher," he said, recognizing the longtime customer. "What can I do for you?" James closed the door behind him. "We need to talk, Mr. Cooper. I was treated with blatant disrespect by your staff yesterday, and I won't stand for it." Henry gestured for James to sit, his expression serious. "Please, tell me what happened." James recounted the incident in detail, his tone steady but pointed. Henry listened carefully, his brows knitting together as the story unfolded. "I'm deeply sorry for what you experienced, Mr. Fletcher," Henry said when James finished. "That kind of behavior is unacceptable. I'll speak to the employees involved immediately." James leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "It's more than just a few employees, Mr. Cooper. This is a systemic issue. Your staff judged me based on my appearance and made assumptions about my worth. If it happened to me, it's happening to others." Henry's expression faltered, and he nodded slowly. "You're right. We need to address this at a deeper level. I'll initiate an internal review and ensure proper training for our staff." James rose, extending his hand. "I'll hold you to that, Mr. Cooper. If things don't change, I'll escalate this matter further." Henry shook his hand, his grip firm. "You have my word, Mr. Fletcher. We'll do better." Back at the bank floor, Julia and Ethan watched as James left the manager's office. Ethan leaned toward Julia, whispering, "What do you think he's up to?" Julia smirked. "Probably complaining about us. Let him. Nothing's going to change." Neither of them realized how wrong they were. The atmosphere at Halcyon Trust Bank shifted noticeably in the days following James Fletcher's visit to the branch manager, Henry Cooper. For the first time, employees began to sense that their behavior was being closely scrutinized. A quiet tension settled over the team, though few could pinpoint its exact source. Julia Morris and Ethan Collier, the employees at the center of James's complaint, remained largely dismissive of the situation. Julia brushed off the incident as inconsequential, while Ethan joked about it during their lunch breaks. But their smug confidence began to waver when Henry Cooper called a staff meeting. The meeting took place in the bank's modern conference room, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bustling city streets. Employees filed in with varying degrees of curiosity and apprehension. Julia and Ethan exchanged uneasy glances as Henry entered the room, his expression serious. "Good afternoon, everyone," Henry began, his voice firm. "I've called this meeting to address a matter of utmost importance. Last week, one of our longtime customers, Mr. James Fletcher, brought to my attention an incident of unacceptable behavior by our staff. This behavior reflects poorly on our branch and, more importantly, goes against the values of respect and professionalism that Halcyon Trust stands for." The room fell silent. Julia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Ethan folded his arms, feigning indifference. Henry's gaze swept across the room. "I've reviewed the situation and spoken with the individuals involved. Let me be clear, discrimination or dismissive behavior toward our customers will not be tolerated. Starting next week, we will implement a mandatory training program focusing on diversity, inclusion, and empathy. Every staff member will participate, regardless of role." Murmurs broke out among the employees. Julia's hand shot up. "Excuse me, Mr. Cooper, but isn't this a bit drastic? It was just one incident." Henry's eyes narrowed. "One incident is one too many, Ms. Morris, and as representatives of this institution, it's our responsibility to ensure it never happens again." Ethan rolled his eyes but stayed silent. Julia leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed in defiance. The following Monday, the training program began, conducted by Dr. Laura Myers, a renowned expert in workplace diversity and inclusion. The sessions were designed to challenge biases and foster understanding. Dr. Myers was a commanding presence, her sharp wit and deep knowledge immediately captivating the group. Julia and Ethan, however, remained skeptical. They approached the first session with thinly veiled disdain, sitting in the back of the room and whispering sarcastic remarks to each other. "Welcome, everyone," Dr. Myers began. "Before we start, I want to make one thing clear. This is not about punishment. It's about growth. We all have biases, whether we realize it or not. My job is to help you recognize them and understand how they affect your interactions." The first exercise was deceptively simple. Participants were asked to write down 3 assumptions they had made about someone based on their appearance or background. When it came time to share, the room grew tense. Employees hesitated, their reluctance revealing how deeply ingrained their biases were. Julia was one of the last to speak. She cleared her throat, avoiding eye contact. I assumed some customers weren't worth our time. Like they couldn't possibly be serious about their requests." Dr. Myers nodded. "Thank you for sharing that. Julia, why do you think you made that assumption?" Julia shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe it's just easier to assume certain things based on experience." Dr. Myers smiled faintly. "Or perhaps based on perception rather than reality. Remember, every assumption you make shapes how you treat someone, and those small actions can have a much larger impact than you realize." As the weeks passed, the sessions grew more intense. One afternoon, Dr. Myers introduced a role reversal exercise. Employees were paired off, with one playing the role of a customer and the other acting as the bank representative. Julia was paired with Mia, a junior banker who had always been quietly observant. Mia played her role with conviction, treating Julia, the customer, with the same dismissiveness and skepticism Julia had shown James. The exercise was short but devastating. For the first time, Julia felt the sting of being dismissed, judged, and devalued. When the session ended, Julia sat quietly at her desk, replaying the exercise in her mind. The experience had left her shaken, though she refused to admit it to anyone. Ethan, meanwhile, struggled with his own revelations. During a storytelling session, a colleague shared how their father had been denied a business loan due to racial discrimination. Despite being more than qualified, the raw emotion in the story struck a chord in Ethan, forcing him to confront the casual cruelty of his own behavior. Outside the bank, James Fletcher continued his quiet advocacy. Though he had no direct involvement in the training sessions, he received regular updates from Henry Cooper. James was pleased to learn that the program was making an impact, albeit slowly. One evening, Henry invited James to observe a session. James agreed, curious to see the process firsthand. When he arrived, the employees were in the middle of a group discussion about privilege and responsibility. Julia and Ethan were uncharacteristically subdued, their earlier arrogance replaced with introspection. Dr. Myers acknowledged James with a warm smile. "Mr. Fletcher, thank you for joining us. Your experience has been a catalyst for this program. Would you like to share a few words?" James rose from his seat, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Good evening," he began. "I've been banking with Halcyon Trust for over 30 years. In that time, I've seen this institution grow and thrive. But last week, I was made to feel like a stranger here. Like my loyalty and my dignity meant nothing." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I don't hold grudges, but I do believe in accountability. The way we treat people matters, not just in business, but in life. If these sessions teach you anything, let it be this: respect costs nothing, but its absence can cost everything." As James sat down, the room erupted in applause. Julia and Ethan exchanged glances, their expressions heavy with the weight of their guilt. The seeds of transformation had been planted, but whether they would flourish depended on the willingness of each individual to nurture them. For Julia and Ethan, the journey was just beginning. The days following James Fletcher's powerful speech brought a subtle but palpable shift in the atmosphere at Halcyon Trust Bank. Employees who had once dismissed the diversity and inclusion training as a mere formality began to approach the sessions with genuine interest. Among them, Julia Morris and Ethan Collier faced the most significant challenges, as their dismissive attitudes had been deeply ingrained. Julia sat alone in her office one afternoon, staring at a blank notepad. The day's training session had left her feeling raw and unsettled. For the first time, she couldn't shake the memory of James Fletcher standing in the lobby, his calm dignity unwavering despite the disrespect he had faced. She flipped open the notepad and began jotting down moments in her career when she might have treated others the way she treated James. As the list grew longer, her stomach twisted with guilt. Faces she had long forgotten came rushing back: an elderly woman she had dismissed for not understanding a complex transaction, a young man she had belittled for his poor grammar, a customer in a worn coat she had labeled a time waster. Julia leaned back in her chair, letting out a shaky breath. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, but along with the guilt came a newfound determination. She resolved to take responsibility, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths about herself. Ethan, meanwhile, wrestled with his own revelations. In the privacy of his apartment, he found himself replaying the storytelling session where his colleague had shared their father's struggles with systemic discrimination. The story had struck a nerve, bringing back memories of his own father, a self-made businessman who often spoke about fairness and treating others with respect. Ethan realized how far he had strayed from those values. His easy jokes, his smug attitude, his dismissive remarks, they were all shields he used to mask his insecurities. Now, those shields felt flimsy and inadequate. During the next training session, Ethan surprised everyone by volunteering to participate in a storytelling exercise. When his turn came, he hesitated, then spoke. "I've spent a lot of time justifying my actions," he admitted, his voice uneven. "But the truth is, I've been wrong. I've treated people unfairly, assuming they weren't worth my time. And I see now how much damage that can cause." The room was silent as Ethan finished. For the first time, his colleagues saw a vulnerability in him that had been absent before. Dr. Myers gave him an encouraging nod. "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step. Ethan, now it's up to you to decide what you'll do next." As the training sessions continued, Julia and Ethan began to make small but meaningful changes. Julia started paying closer attention to her interactions with customers, making an effort to listen and offer genuine assistance. Ethan, once dismissive and aloof, began greeting customers warmly and showing patience even with the most challenging requests. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. Mia, the junior banker who had always been quiet in their presence, approached Julia one day with a hesitant smile. "I just wanted to say, I've noticed a change in you. It's inspiring." Julia felt a flicker of pride but also a pang of regret. "Thank you, Mia. I've got a long way to go. But I'm trying." At the same time, Ethan found himself seeking out Mia for advice. "You seem to have a natural way with people," he admitted one day. "I could learn a thing or two from you." Mia laughed softly. "It's not that hard. Just treat people the way you'd want to be treated. Simple as that." James Fletcher, though not directly involved in the bank's day-to-day operations, kept a close eye on the progress being made. Henry Cooper frequently updated him on the training sessions and the changes taking place among the staff. Each report filled James with a cautious sense of hope. One afternoon, James received an unexpected phone call. It was Julia, her voice trembling slightly as she introduced herself. "Mr. Fletcher," she began, "I know this call is long overdue. But I wanted to apologize. I was wrong to treat you the way I did. And I can't express how sorry I am." James listened quietly, then replied, "Acknowledging your mistakes is important. Ms. Morris, what matters now is how you move forward." Julia nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I understand. Thank you for giving me the chance to make things right." A week later, Ethan reached out to James with a similar apology. The conversation was brief but heartfelt, leaving Ethan with a sense of relief he hadn't felt in weeks. As Julia and Ethan embraced their growth, their transformations began to ripple through the rest of the bank. Their willingness to confront their biases and make amends inspired others to do the same. Conversations about diversity and respect, once avoided, became commonplace among the staff. Henry Cooper took James's advice to heart, introducing new policies to ensure accountability and fairness. These included regular diversity training, a revamped customer service protocol, and an anonymous feedback system for both employees and customers. The change wasn't immediate or perfect, but it was genuine, and as the culture of the bank evolved, so did its reputation. Customers began to notice the difference, praising the staff for their professionalism and kindness. Months later, James returned to Halcyon Trust Bank, not as a disgruntled customer but as a respected figure whose influence had sparked a transformation. Julia greeted him at the reception desk, her smile warm and genuine. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, "it's good to see you again. How can I assist you today?" James's eyes twinkled with quiet pride. "Just here to make a deposit, Ms. Morris, but it's good to see you, too." As he completed his transaction, James noticed Ethan assisting another customer nearby. Ethan's posture was relaxed, his tone friendly and attentive. James couldn't help but smile. The journey had been long and difficult, but the seeds of change he had planted were beginning to bear fruit. For James, there was no greater reward than knowing his quiet persistence had left an enduring legacy. The changes at Halcyon Trust Bank didn't stop at its glass doors. The cultural shift sparked by James Fletcher's quiet but determined advocacy began to ripple outward, touching the lives of employees, customers, and even the community at large. Word of Halcyon Trust Bank's transformation spread quickly, first among regular customers and then throughout the broader neighborhood. Those who had once felt alienated by the bank's elitist atmosphere began to return, drawn by stories of newfound respect and fairness. Mrs. Elaine Porter, a retired schoolteacher, was among the first to notice the difference. She had stopped visiting the bank years earlier after a humiliating encounter with a dismissive teller. But on a crisp morning in late November, she decided to give it another chance. Julia Morris greeted her with a warm smile, her demeanor worlds apart from the icy professionalism that had once defined her. "Good morning, Mrs. Porter. How can I assist you today?" Mrs. Porter hesitated, clutching her handbag. I'd like to discuss opening a new savings account." Julia's smile widened. "Of course, let me walk you through the options." By the time Mrs. Porter left the bank, she couldn't stop smiling. That afternoon, she called a friend to share her experience. "They're different now," she said. "You should give them another try." Within the bank, the changes weren't limited to customer interactions. Employees began to form stronger connections with one another, breaking down the invisible barriers that had once divided them. Julia, who had once kept her colleagues at arm's length, became an unlikely mentor to Mia, the junior banker who had first challenged her behavior. Mia, Julia said one day as they worked through a complicated client request. I have to admit, I've learned a lot from you these past few months. Mia looked up, surprised. From me? I always thought you were the one with all the answers. Julia chuckled softly. Not about this. You've shown me what it means to truly listen to people, to see them for who they are, not who I assume them to be. That's a lesson I'll never forget. Ethan, too, had undergone a significant transformation. He spent less time joking at others' expense and more time reflecting on his interactions. His colleagues noticed the change and began to warm to him in ways they never had before. One afternoon, Ethan approached James Fletcher, who had returned to the bank to meet with Henry Cooper about new community outreach initiatives. Mr. Fletcher, Ethan said hesitantly, I just wanted to say, thank you for calling us out. I didn't see it at the time, but I needed to hear it. James regarded him with a calm smile. Growth is never easy, Ethan, but it's worth the effort. Keep going. As the bank's internal culture shifted, Henry Cooper and James Fletcher turned their attention to the larger community. Together, they launched a series of initiatives aimed at promoting financial literacy and inclusivity. The programs included free workshops on budgeting and saving, mentorship opportunities for aspiring entrepreneurs, and grants for local small businesses. One of the most ambitious projects was the Second Chance Fund, a program designed to provide low-interest loans to individuals and families who had been unfairly denied credit in the past. Julia and Ethan volunteered to oversee the program, seeing it as an opportunity to redeem themselves and give back to the community. At the first grant ceremony, James was invited to speak. Standing before a crowd of local residents and business owners, he addressed the gathering with quiet confidence. This isn't just about money, he said, it's about opportunity. It's about recognizing the potential in every person and giving them the tools to succeed. That's how we build a stronger, more united community. The audience erupted into applause, and James stepped down, his heart full, though he was deeply involved in the bank's transformation and its outreach efforts. James found himself reflecting more on his own life. He thought often about the choices he had made, the obstacles he had overcome, and the legacy he hoped to leave behind. One evening, as he sat in his study with Margaret, he shared his thoughts. You know, he said, when I walked into that bank that day, I never expected all of this to happen. I just wanted them to treat me with respect. But now, it feels like something much bigger. Margaret smiled, her knitting needles clicking softly. That's because it is bigger. James, you've changed more than just the bank. You've changed lives. And you're not done yet. Her words stayed with him. Over the next several weeks, James began drafting a memoir, documenting not just his experiences with Halcyon Trust Bank but the lessons he had learned throughout his life. He hoped it would say, by the end of the year, the bank had fully embraced its new identity as a community-focused institution. Customers returned in greater numbers, drawn by stories of kindness and inclusion. Employees found greater purpose in their work, proud to be part of something meaningful. At the heart of it all was James Fletcher. Though he remained humble about his role, everyone at Halcyon Trust knew that it was his quiet determination that had set everything in motion. One afternoon, as James left the bank after another successful meeting, he paused to look back at the building. The glass windows reflected the bustling street. But inside, he knew, a transformation had taken place, one that would ripple through the community for years to come. James tipped his hat to the staff who waved to him from inside, then turned and walked down the street, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. Behind him, the doors of Halcyon Trust Bank remained open, ready to welcome anyone who walked through them with the respect and dignity they deserved. James Fletcher's work with Halcyon Trust Bank might have begun as a personal mission for dignity and respect, but it was now growing into something far greater. The impact of his actions, combined with the transformative journey of the bank's staff, began to echo beyond the confines of the institution, sparking conversations about equity and justice in unexpected places. As Halcyon Trust Bank's reputation for inclusivity grew, it attracted the attention of community leaders and organizations. One such leader was Dr. Celeste Ward, a professor of social justice and a prominent advocate for systemic change. She approached Henry Cooper and James Fletcher with an idea: a partnership between the bank and the local university to create a program on ethical business practices and community engagement. This could be a model for institutions everywhere. Dr. Ward explained during their first meeting. It's not enough for businesses to say they care about inclusion. They need to show it through their policies and actions. Henry was enthusiastic, but it was James who truly championed the initiative. Education is the foundation of change, he said. If we can inspire young people to lead with integrity, we'll be planting seeds that could grow for generations. The partnership was formalized within weeks. Halcyon Trust Bank became a sponsor for the program, funding scholarships for students from underrepresented backgrounds and hosting workshops on ethical banking practices. James, along with Julia and Ethan, was invited to give guest lectures, sharing their personal journeys and the lessons they had learned. For Julia and Ethan, speaking at the university was both an honor and a challenge. Standing before a room full of eager students, they had to confront their past mistakes head-on and articulate how they had grown. Julia's first lecture was an emotional experience. She spoke candidly about her biases, her initial resistance to change, and the moment she realized the harm she had caused. I thought professionalism meant keeping people at a distance, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But I've learned that true professionalism is about connection, about treating every person with the respect they deserve. The students listened intently, some nodding in agreement while others furiously scribbled notes. When Julia finished, the room erupted into applause, and a young woman approached her afterward. "Thank you for sharing your story," the student said. "It's inspiring to see someone own their mistakes and work to make things right." Ethan's lectures were equally impactful, though his style was more informal. He used humor to break the ice, recounting the cringeworthy moments when he realized how wrong he had been. "I used to think I had all the answers," he admitted. "Turns out, I didn't even know the questions." His honesty resonated with the students, many of whom asked for his advice on navigating their own biases. By the end of the semester, both Julia and Ethan had become mentors to several students, forging connections that would last well beyond the classroom. Back in the neighborhood, Halcyon Trust Bank's initiatives continued to flourish. The Second Chance Fund became a lifeline for families and small businesses, helping them rebuild their lives and dreams. One of the most notable success stories was that of Miguel and Rosa Hernandez, owners of a small bakery that had struggled to secure funding for years. With a loan from the fund, the Hernandezes expanded their bakery, hired additional staff, and launched a catering service. Their success story was featured in the local newspaper, and Miguel was quick to credit James Fletcher and the bank for their support. "They believed in us when no one else would," Miguel said during an interview. "That belief made all the difference." Other businesses followed suit, reinvesting in the community and creating a ripple effect of economic growth. The once struggling neighborhood began to thrive, its streets bustling with new energy and opportunity. Despite the progress, James knew the work was far from over. Change, he often reminded himself, was not a destination but a journey. There were still challenges to face, biases to confront, and systems to improve. One such challenge arose when a former employee of Halcyon Trust Bank, who had left before the transformation began, publicly criticized the institution. "This is just a PR stunt," the former employee claimed in a scathing online post. "The bank hasn't changed, they're just pretending to care." The post gained traction, sparking debates on social media. Henry Cooper and the board of directors were concerned, but James saw it as an opportunity. "We need to be transparent," he said during a meeting. "Let's invite the public to see the changes for themselves." Halcyon Trust Bank hosted an open house event, showcasing their new policies, training programs, and community initiatives. Customers, community leaders, and even skeptics were invited to ask questions and share feedback. Julia and Ethan gave presentations, and Mia led a tour of the revamped customer service center. By the end of the day, many of the attendees were visibly impressed. The event not only silenced much of the criticism but also reinforced the bank's commitment to accountability and growth. Months turned into years, and the story of Halcyon Trust Bank became a case study in transformation. Universities included it in their business ethics curricula, and other institutions sought James Fletcher's advice on fostering inclusivity and respect. James, however, remained humble. For him, the true reward was seeing the tangible impact of the work, the thriving businesses, the empowered students, and the renewed sense of hope in the community. One evening, As he walked through the neighborhood, James stopped outside the bakery owned by the Hernandezes. The warm glow of the lights spilled onto the street, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. James smiled, knowing that this was just one of many stories that would continue to unfold. The journey wasn't over, but it was clear that the seeds of change James had planted were growing into something extraordinary, proof that even the smallest actions, guided by courage and conviction, could create a legacy that would endure for generations. The transformation of Halcyon Trust Bank and its surrounding community had become a beacon of hope. But James Fletcher knew the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. For every step forward, there were new barriers to overcome, and James remained as determined as ever to bridge the gaps that remained. His work continued, drawing him deeper into the lives of the people he had inspired and those still in need of change. One crisp winter morning, James received an invitation to speak at a local high school. The school, nestled in the heart of the neighborhood, was known for its diverse student body and its struggles with limited resources. The principal, Ms. Aria Vaughn, had reached out to James after hearing about his work with Halcyon Trust Bank. "We want our students to understand the value of perseverance and integrity," she explained over the phone. "Your story could inspire them in ways textbooks never could." James arrived at the school to a packed auditorium. The students, ranging from freshmen to seniors, buzzed with anticipation as he stepped onto the stage. Dressed in his signature suit and hat, James carried himself with quiet dignity, his cane tapping softly against the polished wood floor. "Good morning," he began, his deep voice carrying across the room. "My name is James Fletcher, and I'm here to share a story, not about success, but about the lessons we learn when we stand up for what's right." Over the next hour, James recounted his experiences, weaving in anecdotes about resilience, fairness, and the power of empathy. He spoke of the challenges he had faced, the mistakes he had witnessed, and the growth he had seen in others. One student, a tall boy named Marcus with an uncertain expression, raised his hand during the Q&A session. "Mr. Fletcher," he said, "what if you try to stand up for something, but no one listens? How do you keep going?" James smiled, his eyes warm. "That's a good question, Marcus. Sometimes, the people who resist you the most are the ones who need to hear your voice the most. Change doesn't always happen overnight. It takes patience, persistence, and the courage to keep speaking, even when it feels like no one is listening. Because one day, someone will." The auditorium erupted in applause. And afterward, several students approached James to thank him. Marcus lingered at the edge of the crowd, then stepped forward. "Thank you for answering my question," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll remember what you said." James placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You've got a strong voice, young man. Don't be afraid to use it." Meanwhile, Julia Morris had found a new calling as a mentor and leader within the bank. The transformation she had undergone was now helping others who struggled with their own biases and challenges. One of her mentees, a young teller named Priya, had recently joined the bank and was finding it difficult to connect with customers. Julia noticed Priya's hesitance and invited her for coffee after work. "You remind me of myself when I first started here," Julia admitted, stirring her cappuccino. "I thought professionalism meant being distant, but I've learned that building trust is about being authentic." Priya looked surprised. "I never thought someone like you would have struggled." Julia laughed. "Oh, I've struggled plenty, but I've also grown, and if I can do it, so can you." With Julia's guidance, Priya began to approach her role with more confidence. She learned to engage with customers genuinely, finding joy in helping them navigate their financial needs. Julia, watching from the sidelines, felt a deep sense of fulfillment, proof that her journey of change was making a difference. Ethan Collier, too, had embraced his new role within the bank. He took charge of the Second Chance Fund, often venturing into the community to meet with applicants and understand their stories. One afternoon, he met with a young woman named Tamika, a single mother who dreamed of opening a daycare center. She had been denied loans repeatedly due to her limited credit history. Despite having a solid business plan, Ethan listened intently as Tamika shared her vision. "I want to create a safe, nurturing place for kids in this neighborhood," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But no one will give me a chance." Moved by her determination, Ethan worked closely with her to finalize her application. When the loan was approved, Tamika burst into tears, hugging him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "You've changed my life." Ethan left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. For every Tamika, there were countless others waiting for an opportunity. And he was determined to help as many as he could. Amid the progress, James began to notice signs of his age catching up with him. His once steady pace had slowed, and his cane had become more of a necessity than a choice. Margaret, ever perceptive, encouraged him to take things easy. But James resisted. "There's still work to be done," he insisted. "I can rest when it's finished." Margaret shook her head, a mix of affection and exasperation in her eyes. "James, the work will never be finished. That's why you've inspired so many others to carry it forward. You've done enough." Her words stayed with him, though he continued to push himself. Deep down, James knew she was right. The seeds he had planted were growing, tended by people like Julia, Ethan, and the countless others who had taken up the mantle of change. As spring arrived, Halcyon Trust Bank hosted a community celebration to honor the progress that had been made. The event was held in the neighborhood park, with food stalls, music, and activities for families. James was the guest of honor, and as he looked out at the crowd, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The faces before him, smiling, hopeful, and diverse, were a testament to what could be achieved when people came together with empathy and determination. During his speech, James spoke from the heart. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about all of us, what we've built together and what we'll continue to build. Change isn't a destination, it's a journey. And I'm proud to be walking it with all of you." As the crowd erupted into applause, James felt a deep sense of peace. The journey was far from over, but he knew the bridges he had helped build would stand strong for generations to come. The celebration at the park marked a turning point not only for the community but also for James Fletcher. While the event had been filled with laughter, gratitude, and hope, it was also a moment of reflection for James. As he watched children play near the fountain and neighbors exchange stories over food stalls, he realized how far they had come, and how much further they still could go. Back at home, Margaret found James sitting quietly in his study, the soft light from a nearby lamp casting shadows across his face. A worn leather journal lay open on his desk, filled with notes and reflections from the past year. Margaret placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've been working hard, James," she said softly. "Maybe it's time to let others take the lead." James closed the journal and looked up at her. "I've thought about that," he admitted, "but it's hard to step back when there's so much left to do." Margaret pulled up a chair and sat beside him. "You've done more than enough. Julia, Ethan, Mia, they've all grown because of you. And now, they're ready to carry this forward." James nodded slowly, her words sinking in. The truth was, he had seen the passion and determination in those around him. Julia had become a trusted mentor, Ethan a tireless advocate for the underserved, and Mia a bridge between the bank and the community. They were ready to lead, but was he ready to let go? As if fate was testing her readiness, Julia Morris faced her first major challenge as a leader not long after the park celebration. A high-profile client, Mr. Donovan Moore, had demanded special treatment during a loan application. Moore was a wealthy developer with a reputation for cutting corners and exploiting his workers. And his request directly contradicted the bank's new ethical guidelines. "Ms. Morris," he said during their meeting, his voice dripping with entitlement, "I expect this process to move quickly. I'm sure you understand." Julia stared at him, her mind racing. The old Julia might have prioritized his wealth and influence, but the new Julia understood the importance of standing by their principles. "Mr. Moore," she replied, her tone calm but firm, "we're committed to treating all our clients fairly. Your application will be reviewed with the same diligence as any other." Moore's face darkened. "Do you know who you're talking to?" "Yes," Julia said without hesitation, "and I hope you'll understand that we hold all our clients to the same standards." Moore stormed out, vowing to take his business elsewhere. Julia worried briefly about the backlash, but her colleagues, including Ethan and Mia, rallied around her. "You did the right thing," Ethan assured her. "Integrity comes first." The incident became a defining moment for Julia, solidifying her reputation as a leader who prioritized ethics over expedience. Meanwhile, Ethan Collier's work with the Second Chance Fund continued to flourish. His knack for connecting with people had earned him the trust of both the bank and the community. But his biggest test came when he encountered a family facing foreclosure. The Johnsons, a family of 4, had fallen behind on their mortgage payments after the father, Marcus, lost his job. Ethan visited their modest home, sitting with them at their kitchen table to review their situation. "We've tried everything," Marcus said, his voice heavy with defeat. "But no one's willing to help." Ethan looked at the paperwork. His brow furrowed. The numbers were daunting, but he saw potential. After discussing the case with his team, Ethan proposed a solution: restructuring the loan to reduce monthly payments and giving Marcus time to find stable employment. When the plan was approved, the Johnsons were overcome with gratitude. "You gave us hope when we had none," Marcus said, shaking Ethan's hand. Ethan left their home feeling both humbled and inspired. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about restoring dignity and opportunity. As Julia and Ethan stepped into their leadership roles, James began to step back. He spent more time at home, working on his memoir and enjoying quiet evenings with Margaret. But he remained a guiding presence, offering advice when needed and attending important community events. One afternoon, Mia stopped by his house with a small gift, a framed photograph of the park celebration. "I thought you'd like to have this," she said, placing it on his desk. James studied the photograph, his eyes lingering on the smiling faces in the crowd. "Thank you, Mia," he said. "This means more than you know." Mia hesitated before speaking again. "You've changed so many lives, Mr. Fletcher, including mine. I just wanted you to know that." James smiled, his heart full. "That's all I ever wanted, to make a difference." Months turned into a year, and the changes at Halcyon Trust Bank became a permanent part of its culture. The bank's success inspired other institutions to follow suit, sparking a wave of reforms across the industry. Julia, Ethan, and Mia became sought-after speakers, sharing their experiences at conferences and workshops. James's memoir, titled Bridges We Build, was published to critical acclaim. Part memoir, part guidebook, it chronicled his journey and the lessons he had learned about courage, resilience, and the power of community. Proceeds from the book were donated to scholarships and community development programs. At the book's launch event, held in the same park where the celebration had taken place, James stood before a crowd once again. This time, his voice carried both pride and gratitude. "This isn't the end of the story," he said. "It's just the beginning. The work we've done together will continue, carried forward by those who believe in a better future." As the crowd erupted into applause, James felt a profound sense of peace. The legacy he had built was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had walked alongside him, and to those who would carry it forward. James Fletcher's quiet retreat into the background was not the end of his influence. The systems he had helped transform and the people he had inspired continued to evolve, carrying forward his legacy in ways even he hadn't foreseen. Years after James had first challenged Halcyon Trust Bank to be better, Julia Morris found herself standing at a podium in a packed conference hall. She had been named the recipient of the National Leadership in Ethics Award, a recognition of her groundbreaking work in reforming the financial sector's approach to inclusivity and fairness. As she accepted the award, Julia's voice trembled with emotion. "This honor doesn't belong to me alone," she said. "It belongs to the people who taught me the importance of growth and accountability, especially Mr. James Fletcher, whose wisdom and courage set me on this path." Julia's speech was met with a standing ovation. In the audience, Mia and Ethan exchanged proud smiles, knowing how far they had all come since the days when James first walked into their lives. Ethan Collier had found his calling as an advocate for underserved communities. He left Halcyon Trust Bank to start a nonprofit organization focused on providing financial education and support to those most in need. The nonprofit, aptly named Second Chances, became a lifeline for families, entrepreneurs, and individuals seeking to rebuild their lives. At the nonprofit's launch event, Ethan invited James to cut the ceremonial ribbon. "None of this would exist without you," Ethan said, handing James the scissors. James chuckled. "I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it." The neighborhood around Halcyon Trust Bank, once a struggling area, had become a vibrant hub of activity. Small businesses thrived, families found stability, and the park, renamed Fletcher Commons in James's honor, became a symbol of the community's resilience. At the annual community festival held in the park, the Hernandez's Bakery catered the event, while Tamika's daycare provided activities for the children. Marcus Johnson, now a successful contractor, donated time and resources to build a new playground. Each of these successes bore the fingerprints of James's influence, directly or indirectly. In his twilight years, James spent more time at home, surrounded by the warmth of his family and the memories of a life well lived. His health had declined, but his spirit remained strong. Margaret, ever his anchor, was by his side as he penned the final chapter of his memoir. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James sat in his study, flipping through a scrapbook filled with photos and letters from those he had helped. Each page was a testament to the lives he had touched, from Julia and Ethan to countless others whose names he didn't even know. Margaret entered the room, carrying 2 cups of tea. She placed one in front of James and sat beside him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. James smiled, his gaze distant. "How lucky I've been," he said, "to see the good in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. To witness the change they're capable of when given the chance." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You've given so much, James, and they'll carry it forward." James Fletcher passed away peacefully one spring morning, surrounded by his loved ones. The news of his passing spread quickly, and tributes poured in from all corners of the community and beyond. The park held a memorial service attended by hundreds, residents, former bank employees, and leaders who had been inspired by his work. Julia, Ethan, and Mia each spoke at the service, their voices filled with both sorrow and gratitude. James Fletcher taught us that change begins with one small act of courage. Julia said, "He showed us how to be better, not just for ourselves but for everyone around us." Years later, the seeds James had planted continued to bear fruit. The programs he inspired expanded, reaching new communities and transforming countless lives. His memoir, Bridges We Build, became required reading in schools and businesses alike, a guide to leadership rooted in empathy and accountability. In the park that bore his name, a bronze statue of James was erected. It depicted him standing tall, cane in hand, his face calm and resolute. At the base of the statue, an inscription read, "One person can build a bridge, many can cross it together." Every day, people gathered at Fletcher Commons, children played on the swings, families shared picnics, and individuals paused to read the inscription, drawing inspiration from the man who had changed their lives. Though James Fletcher was gone, his legacy lived on in the hearts and actions of those who followed in his footsteps. His story was proof that even the smallest actions, guided by courage and kindness, could ripple outward to create a better world.